Tuesday morning, 9:47 a.m. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't putting a man on the moon. It wasn't splitting the atom. It wasn't even inventing the chocolate chip cookie, though that came pretty damn close. No, humanity's greatest achievement was what happened when every single form of electronic communication on Earth went completely, utterly, magnificently silent. And the aliens responsible? Well, they were about to learn why you should never ever underestimate a species that once convinced itself that pineapple belonged on pizza. Zerion Blingwhistle was having what he confidently believed to be the worst morning of his 43-year career as a telecommunications engineer. His coffee had gone cold, his computer screen displayed nothing but static, and his smartphone had somehow transformed into what appeared to be a very expensive paperweight. More concerning still, the emergency radio in his basement bunker, which he'd installed during a particularly paranoid phase involving Y2K preparations, was producing nothing but the sort of silence typically reserved for awkward family dinners. "What the actual—" he began, then stopped, realizing that shouting at inanimate objects was probably not the most productive use of his rapidly dwindling sanity. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Dr. Velma Snodgrass was experiencing her own technological apocalypse. As the head of Global Communications Emergency Response, she'd seen her fair share of communication breakdowns, satellite failures, internet outages, the occasional solar flare that made electronics throw what could only be described as a cosmic tantrum. But this was different. This was complete. Her emergency protocols demanded she contact 17 different government agencies, 43 international organizations, and at least one very confused pizza delivery service. Unfortunately, all 17 agencies, 43 organizations, and the pizza place were experiencing the exact same problem. Their phones had decided to take an unscheduled vacation from the concept of functionality. The truly remarkable thing about humanity, however, is that when faced with the impossible, they tend to respond, not with panic, but with the sort of creative problem-solving that would make a Swiss Army knife jealous. Zerion, after exhausting his vocabulary of colorful expletives, did what any reasonable human would do when faced with a complete breakdown of modern civilization. He walked outside, looked around at his equally confused neighbors, and did something that hadn't been done in his neighborhood since approximately 1987. He talked to them. "Anyone else's phone completely buggered?" he called out to Mrs. Frumplebottom, who was standing in her garden, looking like someone who'd just discovered that gravity had filed for early retirement. "Everything's dead," she replied, waving her phone in the air like a technological prayer flag. "Television, radio, even my smart refrigerator has gone completely stupid." Within minutes, Zerion's quiet suburban street had transformed into something resembling a very polite post-apocalyptic gathering. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly engaged in animated discussions about backup plans, emergency supplies, and whether anyone remembered how to use a rotary phone. Dr. Snodgrass, meanwhile, had reached a similar conclusion from her downtown office building. After spending 20 minutes trying to restart systems that refused to acknowledge her existence, she made a decision that would have horrified her technology-dependent younger self. She abandoned her office and went outside to find actual human beings. The city streets were already filling with people who looked like extras from a movie about the day the internet died. But here's where things got interesting. And by interesting, we mean absolutely bonkers. Instead of descending into chaos, people were talking. Not the quick, distracted talking of the digital age, but the slow, purposeful talking of people who suddenly had all the time in the world because Netflix wasn't working. A street musician named Galahad Funksworth discovered that without electronic amplification, he could still make music. Who knew? A food truck operator called Brunhilde Snackcake realized that she could still cook food even if she couldn't process credit cards, and people were surprisingly willing to pay with actual cash, which they'd apparently been carrying around for years without realizing it. But the real magic happened when someone, nobody remembers who, suggested that maybe, just maybe, they should try to figure out what was going on. Doctor. Snodgrass found herself at the center of an impromptu street council, surrounded by people from every walk of life imaginable. There was Zarian with his engineering expertise, Mrs. Frumplebottom with her surprisingly extensive knowledge of pre-digital communication methods, Galahad with his street-level networking skills, and Brunhilde with her inexplicable ability to organize chaos into something resembling order. Right then, Doctor, Snodgrass announced to the growing crowd, "It seems we've got ourselves a proper communications blackout. The question is, what do we do about it?" The answer, as it turned out, was both simpler and more complex than anyone could have imagined. Mrs. Frumplebottom, who had lived through the transition from letters to email and found the whole thing rather suspect to begin with, made the first practical suggestion. "In my day, we used flags." "Flags?" Zarian sputtered. "We're trying to coordinate a planetary response to a communications crisis, not signal a ship at sea." "Don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Frumplebottom replied, with the sort of authority that only comes from having successfully raised 5 children without the internet. "Flags work perfectly well for complex communications. You just need to know the code." And that's when things got properly weird. Within hours, humanity had begun what historians would later describe as the great communication revival of the digital age. Semaphore flags appeared on rooftops. Smoke signals began rising from backyards. Someone in Nebraska started a drum circle that was supposedly sending messages to Colorado, though nobody was entirely sure what those messages were. The truly remarkable thing was how quickly it all organized itself. Without any central planning, without any government coordination, without even a single PowerPoint presentation, humans across the globe began developing an intricate network of analog communication methods. In Tokyo, a group of origami enthusiasts discovered that paper cranes could carry messages between buildings when tied to very small balloons. The balloons, purchased in bulk from a party supply store that couldn't process electronic payments but accepted exact change with surprising enthusiasm, created what locals began calling the Crane Mail Network. Takeshi Paper Folding, a retired insurance adjuster with an unhealthy obsession with geometric precision, became the unofficial coordinator of the Tokyo operation. He spent his days teaching others the fine art of message crane construction, which required not only precise folding techniques, but also careful attention to weight distribution, wind patterns, and the increasingly important science of, will this balloon actually float or just mock me from the ground? The system worked surprisingly well, considering it was basically airmail operated by enthusiastic amateurs in physics. Messages were written on rice paper using traditional calligraphy brushes, folded into cranes according to specifications that would have made NASA engineers weep with joy, attached to helium balloons with thread stolen from sewing kits and released into the Tokyo sky with the sort of ceremonial dignity typically reserved for launching spacecraft. In London, the pigeons, which had been regarded as flying rats for decades, suddenly found themselves in high demand as organic messaging systems. The transformation of London's pigeon population from urban nuisance to critical communication infrastructure was perhaps the most dramatic career change in avian history. Nigel Crumsworth, a retired postal worker who had spent 30 years complaining about the decline of proper letter writing, discovered that he possessed an unexpected talent for pigeon communication. His small apartment in Brixton became the unofficial headquarters of what newspapers would later call the Pigeon Post Renaissance. The pigeons, for their part, seemed delighted by their sudden elevation in social status. Birds that had previously been shooed away from park benches were now being offered premium breadcrumbs and treated with the sort of respect typically reserved for government officials. Several pigeons developed what could only be described as professional attitudes, refusing to carry messages unless properly compensated with high-quality seeds. The Pigeon Post network grew from Nigel's apartment to encompass most of central London within 72 hours. Messages were written on specially designed lightweight paper, rolled into tiny scrolls, and attached to the bird's legs with thread that had been blessed by at least 3 different religious denominations. Because, as Nigel explained, you can never be too careful when dealing with divine intervention disguised as urban wildlife. In New York, the subway musicians formed what they called the Underground Message Network, using their acoustic knowledge to send coded musical messages through the tunnels. This was perhaps the most ambitious communication project ever attempted by people whose primary qualification was the ability to play Wonderwall in 17 different keys. The system worked on the principle that sound travels through subway tunnels in predictable ways, and that if you knew the acoustic properties of the transit system well enough, you could use music to send information between stations. This required musicians to learn not only a complex musical code, but also the precise timing needed to account for train schedules, tunnel echoes, and the acoustic interference caused by several thousand people asking each other if they knew why the trains weren't running. Melody Saxophone, a jazz musician who had been busking in Penn Station for 8 years, became the unofficial conductor of the underground network. Her small apartment, filled with hand-drawn maps of the subway system, marked with acoustic sweet spots, optimal performance times, and detailed notes on which train conductors were most likely to allow emergency musical communications during service interruptions. The musical code itself was a masterpiece of practical artistry. Basic information was conveyed through rhythm patterns with different time signatures indicating different types of messages. Melody indicated urgency, harmony provided context, and complex improvisational passages could convey surprisingly detailed information to anyone who had learned to translate jazz into English. But the masterpiece, the absolute crown jewel of human analog ingenuity, was happening in a small town in Kansas. Meredith Twiddlebonk was a retired choreographer who had spent 40 years teaching people how to move their bodies in ways that looked vaguely like dancing. When the great silence hit, she realized that her particular set of skills might actually be useful for something other than embarrassing teenagers at school productions. Standing in the middle of the town's football field, she began what she called interpretive communication dance. By the end of the first day, half the town was participating in what looked like the world's largest game of charades, but was actually a sophisticated system for transmitting complex information through carefully choreographed movement. The system worked like this. Basic arm positions represented letters, leg movements indicated numbers, and full body gestures conveyed complex concepts. A simple message like "need food supplies" became a graceful dance sequence that could be performed in any open space and understood by anyone who'd learned the basic vocabulary. But Meredith, being a perfectionist who had once spent 6 months choreographing a dance about the water cycle, didn't stop at basic functionality. She began developing regional variations, cultural adaptations, and what she called emotional subcoding, which allowed dancers to convey not just information, but the feelings associated with that information. The Kansas variation emphasized agricultural metaphors, with movements that mimicked farming activities to represent different types of information. Planting motions indicated new information. Harvesting gestures meant information was confirmed, and the complex dance sequence known as dealing with locusts was used to indicate that something was going terribly wrong and everyone needed to pay attention immediately. Within a week, interpretive communication dance had spread across 3 states. Within 2 weeks, variations of it were appearing on every continent. Humanity had inadvertently created the world's first global dance-based communication network, and it was magnificent. The New York style incorporated elements of subway navigation and the art of hailing taxis. Dancers would perform elaborate sequences that mimicked the experience of urban navigation, with sharp directional changes indicating changes in information flow, and the famous waiting for the end train movement, representing any situation requiring patience and determination. The Tokyo version was heavily influenced by origami principles, with dancers creating geometric patterns with their bodies that corresponded to different folding techniques. The precision required was extraordinary, but the results were beautiful enough that several performances were mistaken for avant-garde art installations. The London interpretation somehow managed to incorporate cueing etiquette into its basic grammar. Messages were delivered through carefully choreographed sequences that looked remarkably like very enthusiastic cue management, complete with subtle movements indicating proper cue position, appropriate cue behavior, and the all-important cue jump alert, which was performed with the sort of righteous indignation that only the British could truly master. But here's where our story takes a turn toward the truly magnificent realm of cosmic misunderstanding. Approximately 93 million miles above Earth's surface, aboard a ship that looked like what might happen if a cathedral had a passionate affair with a very large kitchen appliance, the Vorthakians were having what could generously be described as a complete nervous breakdown. Captain Zlobnik Phlegmhammer had been so confident in his plan. The Vorthakians, you see, were a deeply logical species who believed that all intelligent life forms could be neatly categorized into one of 17 different civilization types. Humans, based on their extensive electronic communications networks, had been classified as Type 7, technologically dependent collective consciousness. The classification had been based on 3 years of careful observation. Humans spent most of their time staring at rectangular devices, talking to machines, and organizing their entire civilization around the flow of electronic information. They were clearly a hive mind species that had achieved consciousness through technological integration. Disable their communications grid, and they would immediately collapse into confused, isolated individuals, incapable of coordinated action. The plan had been beautifully simple. A focused electromagnetic pulse that would disable all electronic communications without causing permanent damage to the infrastructure. The planet would be defenseless within hours, ready for what the Vorthakians euphemistically called cultural reorganization, which was basically conquest with better marketing. The Vorthakians had used this strategy successfully on 47 different worlds, each populated by species that had made the mistake of becoming too dependent on their technology. It was, quite literally, a textbook operation that had never failed. The plan had worked perfectly for exactly 37 minutes. "Captain," his subordinate Lieutenant Blorpik Sneeze-Nozzle reported with the sort of voice typically reserved for announcing that the universe had filed a complaint against reality. "The humans are dancing. Dancing." Captain Phlegmhammer's 17 eye stalks swiveled in confusion. "That makes no sense. Type 7 civilizations don't dance when their communication networks fail. They collapse into chaos and despair." Lieutenant Sneeze-Nozzle was studying the surveillance data with an expression that suggested he had recently discovered that mathematics had been lying to him about fundamental principles. "Captain, they're not just dancing. They're dancing in patterns, coordinated patterns, across multiple continents." "Monsieur, perhaps they're a different type than we thought," suggested Ensign Quibblesnort Blurpington, the ship's junior xenobiologist, who had been hoping for a quiet day of cataloguing space plankton, and instead found himself trying to explain why an entire planet had apparently decided to respond to technological failure with interpretive choreography. "Impossible," the captain bellowed. All 17 eye stalks now focused on his subordinates with the intensity of someone discovering that gravity had been optional all along. We've been observing them for 3 rotational periods. They spend most of their time staring at small rectangular screens and speaking to devices they hold near their auditory sensors. Classic Type 7 behavior. Lieutenant Sneezenozzle tentatively directed the captain's attention to the main viewing screen, which showed a real-time image of Earth's surface. What they saw would have been beautiful if it wasn't so completely terrifying from a Vorthakian perspective. Across every continent, in every major population center, humans were moving in coordinated patterns. Not the chaotic thrashing of a civilization in collapse, but the precise, purposeful movements of a species that seemed to be getting more organized, not less. In Kansas, thousands of people were performing synchronized dance sequences in open fields. In Tokyo, the sky was filled with paper cranes, carrying messages through the air in formation patterns that looked suspiciously like military coordination. In London, flocks of pigeons were flying in precise geometric formations that suggested they were following some kind of advanced navigation protocol. "Captain," Lieutenant Sneezenozzle whispered, his voice carrying the sort of existential dread typically reserved for discovering that your entire understanding of reality was based on a clerical error. "What if they're not Type 7? What if they're Type 12? Type 12 civilizations were the stuff of Vorthakian nightmares. They were species so advanced that they could coordinate complex activities through methods that transcended traditional communication entirely. They were telepathic, or quantum entangled, or possessed of some other cosmic ability that made them essentially unstoppable once they decided to do something. The distinguishing characteristic of Type 12 civilizations was their ability to maintain perfect coordination even when their technological infrastructure was completely disabled. They were species that had evolved beyond the need for machines, using biological or quantum methods to maintain collective consciousness across planetary distances. Captain Flemhammer's eye stalks began to tremble. But that would mean we just picked a fight with a species that doesn't need electronic communications, the lieutenant finished. A species that can coordinate globally using methods we don't understand and can't intercept. The implications were staggering. If humans were actually a Type 12 civilization, then everything the Vorthakians thought they understood about Earth was wrong. The electronic communications network wasn't their primary coordination method. It was just a convenient tool they used for casual interactions. Their real communication system was something far more advanced, something that allowed them to maintain perfect planetary coordination through methods that appeared to be completely biological. Down on Earth, completely unaware that they were causing an interstellar panic attack, humans continued to solve problems with the sort of cheerful determination that had once convinced them to build pyramids without proper machinery. Xerion had discovered that his neighbor, a retired teacher named Percival Quibblethwaite, knew Morse code. Together, they'd rigged up a system using car headlights to send messages across the city. The messages weren't particularly sophisticated. Mostly things like "coffee shop on 5th Street still open," and "does anyone know how to milk a cow?" But they were getting through. The car headlight network had grown from a simple neighborhood system to a city-wide communication grid within 48 hours. Xerion and Percival had become the unofficial coordinators of what local newspapers were calling the automotive telegraph system, though most participants simply called it flashing cars at each other until something makes sense. The system required precise timing, careful positioning, and a working knowledge of both Morse code and local traffic patterns. Messages were transmitted by parking cars in strategic locations and flashing headlights in coded sequences. The process was slow, required multiple relay stations, and occasionally resulted in traffic jams caused by drivers who thought they were witnessing some kind of automotive emergency. But it worked. Within days, the car headlight network was carrying everything from grocery shopping coordination to medical emergency information. Several romantic relationships began when couples discovered they could send love letters through synchronized headlight flashing, though the romantic effect was somewhat diminished by the need to translate everything through Morse code first. Dr. Snodgrass had teamed up with a group of ham radio enthusiasts who, it turned out, had been preparing for exactly this sort of situation for decades. While their radios weren't working, their knowledge of signal propagation and antenna design was proving invaluable for setting up networks of mirrors that could relay light signals across vast distances. The mirror network was perhaps the most technically sophisticated of all the analog communication systems. It required precise calculations of sun angles, careful positioning of reflective surfaces, and coordination between operators who might be separated by hundreds of miles but needed to maintain perfect timing to relay messages across multiple relay points. Dr. Snodgrass discovered that she had a natural talent for what the ham radio operators called optical signal architecture. Her background in emergency communications had given her an intuitive understanding of network redundancy, signal routing, and backup systems that translated perfectly to mirror-based communication. The network grew from a simple point-to-point system to a continent-spanning web of relay stations within a week. Messages could travel from New York to Los Angeles in under 6 hours, provided the weather was clear and nobody forgot to clean their mirrors. The system was so efficient that several government agencies began quietly taking notes for potential future use. Mrs. Frumplebottom had become something of a celebrity in her neighborhood for her encyclopedic knowledge of pre-digital communication methods. She was teaching anyone who would listen the fine art of semaphore flag operation, and her students were becoming teachers themselves, spreading the knowledge with evangelical enthusiasm. The semaphore flag network was probably the most traditionally military of all the communication systems, but Mrs. Frumplebottom had adapted it for civilian use with characteristic efficiency. Her version included not only the standard maritime flag alphabet, but also specialized signals for common civilian needs, grocery shopping, childcare coordination, and the all-important "Is anyone making coffee?" inquiry. Mrs. Frumplebottom's classes grew from a small neighborhood gathering to a citywide educational phenomenon within days. Her students ranged from curious children to military veterans who remembered learning flag signals decades earlier. The intergenerational knowledge transfer was remarkable, with older participants sharing historical context, while younger ones contributed energy and enthusiasm. But the real breakthrough came when someone realized that the global positioning system might be down, but the stars were still exactly where they were supposed to be. A group of amateur astronomers in Chile, led by a retired physics professor named Galileo Starwatcher, started using star charts to coordinate with similar groups in other countries. By referencing stellar positions and using basic trigonometry, they could determine precise timing for coordinated activities across multiple continents. The stellar coordination system was perhaps the most intellectually ambitious of all the analog communication methods. It required not only extensive knowledge of astronomy, but also precise mathematical calculations, careful attention to time zone differences, and the sort of faith in human coordination that would have impressed the builders of Stonehenge. The system worked by designating specific stellar configurations as timing references for coordinated activities. When Sirius reached a particular position relative to the horizon, every participating group would simultaneously perform a predetermined action. Light signals would flash, smoke would rise, and interpretive dancers would perform synchronized routines that could be observed from orbit. What had started as a simple desire to know what time it was had evolved into a method for synchronizing actions across multiple continents, using nothing more advanced than star charts, pocket calculators, and the sort of collaborative enthusiasm typically reserved for flash mobs. And they were being observed from orbit. The Vorthakians were watching every single coordinated action with increasing horror. "They're synchronized!" Captain Flemhammer wailed, all 17 eye stalks now writhing in distress like confused tentacles at a disco. "How are they synchronized without any form of electronic communication? It's scientifically impossible." Lieutenant Sneezenozzle was studying the data streams with the expression of someone who had just discovered that 2 + 2 had started equaling fish. "Captain, according to our analysis, they're using celestial mechanics as a timing reference. They're coordinating continental-scale activities based on the position of stars." "Stars? Stars?" The captain's voice reached a pitch that made several pieces of equipment start vibrating sympathetically. "What kind of civilization uses stellar navigation for military coordination?" "A Type 15 civilization," Ensign Blurpington whispered from his workstation, his voice carrying the sort of cosmic dread typically reserved for discovering that your gods have been playing practical jokes on you for millennia. Type 15. Civilizations were purely theoretical. They were species so advanced that they had transcended the need for technology entirely, operating on principles that existed beyond the understanding of lesser species. They were the cosmic equivalent of graduation from the University of Existence, and encountering one was like a toddler trying to explain quantum physics to Einstein. Type 15 civilizations didn't just coordinate through biological or quantum methods. They had achieved such perfect integration with the fundamental forces of the universe that they could use celestial mechanics, geological processes, and planetary dynamics as communication tools. They were species that had learned to think on cosmic scales, treating entire solar systems like components of vast biological organisms. "But that's impossible," Captain Flemhammer protested weakly. "They were using primitive electronic devices. We saw them talking to small, rectangular screens." "Perhaps," Lieutenant Sneezenozzle suggested, with the sort of delicacy typically reserved for defusing bombs or telling your mother that you've joined a traveling circus. "They were just playing with toys." The idea that humanity's entire technological civilization might be the equivalent of cosmic finger painting was too much for the captain's sanity to process. It suggested that what the Vorthakians had interpreted as a species' primary communication system was actually just casual entertainment, the way a Type 15 civilization might amuse itself during slow periods between cosmic-scale projects. One by one, his eye stalks began to droop in defeat as the implications sank in. If humans were a Type 15 civilization, then the Vorthakians had just attempted to conquer a species that could theoretically rearrange solar systems for fun. It was like trying to mug a cosmic force of nature, and the cosmic force of nature was being polite about it so far. Meanwhile, on Earth, humans were having what many would later describe as the most fun they'd had since the invention of bubble wrap. The worldwide network of analog communication had evolved into something resembling a cross between a giant party and a global science experiment. Messages were flowing across continents through an intricate web of light signals, smoke patterns, flag semaphore, interpretive dance, and what appeared to be the world's largest game of telephone played by an entire planet. But the true masterpiece of human analog communication was happening in Iceland. A group of geologists, led by a woman named Brunhilde Lavaflow, had discovered that the country's extensive geothermal activity could be used to create controlled steam emissions. By carefully regulating the pressure at various geothermal sites, they could create what amounted to the world's largest steam-powered telegraph system. The discovery had happened by accident when Brunhilde, who was studying geothermal pressure variations for her doctoral thesis, noticed that certain pressure changes created distinctive patterns of steam release. With the sort of scientific curiosity that had once convinced people to see what would happen if they put electricity through a pickle, she began experimenting with controlled pressure manipulation. The system worked by using geothermal vents to create specific patterns of steam release. Short bursts represented dots, long releases represented dashes, and the thermal dynamics of different geological formations allowed for incredibly complex messaging. Iceland had essentially transformed itself into a living, breathing Morse code transmitter that could be read from space. The technical challenges were enormous. Steam pressure had to be carefully regulated to create clear signals without damaging the geothermal equipment. Weather conditions affected visibility and steam dispersion. The timing required to coordinate multiple geothermal sites across the country demanded the sort of precision typically associated with space launches. But Brunhilde and her team of geology students, environmental engineers, and enthusiastic volunteers solved each problem with the methodical determination that had once convinced their ancestors to settle on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic and call it home. The geothermal communication system became operational within 5 days of the initial electromagnetic pulse. Iceland's first message, transmitted through coordinated steam releases from 7 different geothermal sites, was visible from orbit and translated to, "Hello world, Iceland calling, having good time, wish you were here." The Vorthakians, observing this development through their increasingly panicked surveillance systems, reached a collective conclusion that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying from their perspective. "Captain?" Lieutenant Sneeze-Nozzle reported, with a voice that suggested he had personally witnessed the heat death of the universe. "They've turned an entire planet into a communication device." "An entire planet?" "The geological formations are being used as transmission elements. They're not just communicating through their planet, Captain. They're communicating AS, their planet." This was the moment when Captain Flemhammer's remaining sanity decided to file for early retirement. The idea that humanity might be a Type 15 civilization that could literally use planetary geology as a communication system was beyond anything in Vorthakian experience. It suggested a level of cosmic integration that made them seem less like a species and more like a fundamental force of nature. The captain's 17 eye stalks performed what could only be described as a synchronized collapse, each one drooping in defeat as he processed the implications of trying to conquer a species that could apparently treat entire planets like biological organs in some kind of cosmic organism. "What do we do?" the captain whispered, his voice carrying the sort of existential despair typically reserved for discovering that your entire civilization's understanding of physics was based on a mathematical error. "We could try to communicate with them," Lieutenant Sneeze-Nozzle suggested hopefully. "Communicate? With a species that talks through planets? What would we even say? Hello, we're the Vorthakians. We interrupted your communications. Sorry about that. Please don't turn our solar system into a giant telephone." But communication, as it turned out, was exactly what was needed. The breakthrough came when a 12-year-old girl named Pixie Wonderbottom, who lived in a small town in Montana, made a discovery that would change everything. While helping her grandfather maintain his collection of antique radio equipment, she found an old shortwave radio that, for reasons no one could explain, was still working. The radio was a 1960s military surplus unit that her grandfather had restored as a hobby project. It was built with vacuum tubes, analog components, and the sort of over-engineered construction that made it essentially immune to electromagnetic interference. While every modern electronic device on Earth had been rendered inoperable, this technological dinosaur was chugging along happily, picking up signals from across the radio spectrum. Most of the signals were just static and interference, but there was one frequency that was broadcasting something different. It wasn't coming from anywhere on Earth. It was coming from directly overhead, and it was broadcasting in what appeared to be terrible English. "Hello, Earth humans," the voice crackled through the static. "This is Captain Zlorbnik Flegemhammer of the Vorthakian exploration vessel Inevitable Bureaucracy. We need to talk." Pixie, being 12 and therefore completely fearless in the face of cosmic impossibility, picked up the microphone and responded with the sort of directness that only children and drunk people can achieve. "Why did you break all our phones, you stupid aliens?" There was a long pause. Then, You can hear us? Duh! You're really loud. And why are you shouting? We're shouting because we're terrified. We thought you were a Type 15 civilization that could manipulate planetary geology for communication purposes. Pixie considered this. What's a Type 15 civilization? It's a species so advanced that they don't need technology because they've transcended the physical limitations of the universe and can manipulate reality through pure consciousness. Oh, Pixie said. No, we're just really good at making stuff work when it breaks. Also, what's a Vorthakian? And that was how first contact between humanity and an alien civilization began. With a 12-year-old girl explaining to a terrified alien captain that humans weren't cosmic demigods, they were just really, really good at improvising. The conversation that followed would later be studied by xenopsychologists, communication specialists, and at least 3 different university departments dedicated to the study of cosmic misunderstandings. So you're not a telepathic collective consciousness? Captain Flemhammer asked hopefully. Nope, we're just people. We like pizza and arguing about sports. And you don't use stellar mechanics for military coordination? We use stellar mechanics to figure out what time it is so we can all dance at the same time. It's fun. Dancing. You're coordinating globally through recreational dance. And smoke signals, and flag waving, and Mr. Henderson down the street figured out how to use his lawnmower to make patterns in his grass that spell out grocery lists. The relief in Captain Flemhammer's voice was audible across interstellar space. So you're not going to use planetary geology to turn our homeworld into a communication relay? We're using planetary geology to send messages about where the good coffee shops are. Iceland figured out how to use volcanoes to say, meet at the community center for potluck dinner. There was another long pause. Then in a voice that suggested the captain was reconsidering every major life decision that had led to this moment. Would you like your electronic communications back? That would be awesome, Pixie replied. But maybe wait until after the weekend. Everyone's having so much fun with the dancing, and Mrs. Peterson finally learned semaphore flags, and she's really proud of herself. And that was how humanity negotiated the return of global communications, by asking politely and mentioning Mrs. Peterson's personal growth. Captain Flemhammer, who had expected to spend the day conquering a planet and instead found himself discussing potluck dinners with a child, made a decision that would fundamentally alter Vorthakian understanding of the universe. Lieutenant, he announced, update the civilization classification database. Humans are type. He paused, struggling to find a category that encompassed deceptively sophisticated but mostly interested in coffee and dancing. Type 23, Lieutenant Sneeze-Nozzle suggested. Adaptively creative? Type 23, the captain agreed. And add a note. Do not attempt conquest. They'll just turn it into a party and somehow make you feel bad about yourself. The Vorthakians spent the next 3 days carefully restoring Earth's electronic communication systems, working with the sort of meticulous attention to detail typically reserved for defusing bombs or performing surgery on family members. They were determined to leave no trace of their interference, partly out of professional pride and partly because they were genuinely afraid that if they broke anything permanently, the humans might decide to demonstrate some of their more advanced capabilities. The restoration process was complicated by the fact that humans had begun integrating their analog communication systems with the returning electronic networks. Car headlight Morse code operators were using smartphones to coordinate timing. Interpretive dancers were live streaming their performances to help spread the dance vocabulary. The geothermal communication system in Iceland had been connected to the internet, allowing people around the world to request personalized steam messages. 3 days later, electronic communications were restored to Earth with the sort of quiet efficiency that suggested the Vorthakians really wanted to forget the whole incident had ever happened. But humanity didn't forget. Dr. Snodgrass kept her emergency semaphore flags and established a formal training program for analog communication methods. The program became so popular that it was eventually adopted by emergency services worldwide, creating a backup communication network that could function independently of electronic systems. Zerian maintained his network of car headlight Morse code operators, which evolved into a hobbyist community dedicated to preserving traditional communication skills. The group met monthly to practice their techniques, share technical improvements, and argue about whether LED headlights produced cleaner Morse code signals than traditional incandescent bulbs. Mrs. Frumplebottom started teaching communication classes at the community college, where her course, Pre-Digital Communication Methods, became one of the most popular electives in the school's history. Her students ranged from curious teenagers to military veterans, all eager to learn skills that had nearly been lost to the digital age. Meredith Twiddlebonk's interpretive communication dance became an Olympic sport, complete with international competitions, standardized judging criteria, and the sort of intense training programs that would have made ancient gladiators weep with exhaustion. The sport attracted athletes from every discipline imaginable, combining the physical demands of gymnastics with the intellectual challenges of simultaneous translation. The Tokyo Origami Crane Mail Network evolved into a global messaging service that operated parallel to traditional postal systems. The service was particularly popular for romantic correspondence, as there was something undeniably charming about receiving love letters delivered by hand-folded paper birds attached to helium balloons. Brunhilde Lavaflow's geothermal communication system in Iceland became a tourist attraction, with visitors traveling from around the world to witness messages being transmitted through controlled volcanic steam. The system was eventually integrated into Iceland's national emergency communications infrastructure, providing a backup method for coordinating disaster response that couldn't be disrupted by any conceivable technological failure. The London Pigeon Post network maintained its operations as both a functional communication system and a celebration of urban wildlife cooperation. Nigel Crumsworth became something of a celebrity, appearing on television programs to demonstrate pigeon communication techniques and advocate for better treatment of urban birds. Several of his most reliable pigeon messengers were awarded honorary citizenship by the City of London, complete with tiny ceremonial medals and their own social media accounts. But perhaps most remarkably, the stellar coordination system developed by the Chilean astronomers became the foundation for a new field of study: cosmic communication theory. Universities around the world established departments dedicated to exploring how intelligent species might use celestial mechanics, geological processes, and other natural phenomena for large-scale coordination. The field attracted researchers from astronomy, geology, biology, communications theory, and philosophy. They studied everything from how migrating birds coordinate their flights to how tidal patterns might be used to synchronize activities across oceanic distances. The research had practical applications for space exploration, disaster preparedness, and understanding how life might communicate across cosmic distances. Dr. Galileo Starwatcher became the first professor of applied stellar communications at the University of Santiago, where his courses attracted students from around the world, eager to learn how to coordinate activities using nothing more advanced than star charts and basic mathematics. His textbook, When Technology Fails, A Guide to Cosmic Scale Communication, became required reading for emergency management professionals worldwide. The underground message network in New York evolved into a cultural phenomenon that combined music, mathematics, and urban exploration. Musicians developed increasingly sophisticated coding systems that could convey complex information through jazz improvisation, classical compositions, and even hip-hop rhythms. The network's annual competitions attracted performers who could transmit everything from shopping lists to philosophical treatises through purely musical means. Melody saxophone established the Institute for Acoustic Information Transfer, where researchers studied how sound could be used for communication in environments where electronic systems were unavailable or unreliable. The Institute's work had applications for underwater communication, cave rescue operations, and space exploration scenarios where radio communications might be blocked by planetary interference. But the most lasting impact of the Great Silence wasn't any single communication system or technological innovation. It was the realization that humanity's greatest strength had never been their machines, their networks, or their electronic devices. Their greatest strength was their ability to adapt, to improvise, to find solutions using whatever tools were available, and to coordinate complex activities through nothing more than creativity, determination, and a shared understanding that problems existed to be solved, not to be surrendered to. The experience had revealed something profound about human nature. When stripped of all their technological advantages, when faced with what should have been an insurmountable challenge, they didn't panic. They didn't collapse into chaos. They didn't spend their time arguing about whose fault it was or whose responsibility it was to fix it. They rolled up their sleeves, looked around to see what resources were available, and got to work. They talked to neighbors they'd ignored for years. They rediscovered skills that had been forgotten. They invented new solutions, using materials that had been lying around unused. They turned a global crisis into a global collaboration, coordinating activities across continents using methods that would have been familiar to their great-grandparents. The psychological impact was as significant as the practical achievements. People who had felt isolated and disconnected in the digital age discovered that they were part of a global community that could function even when all the electronic connections were severed. They learned that human ingenuity was not dependent on silicon chips or fiber optic cables, but on the willingness to try, to experiment, to fail, and to try again until something worked. Children who had grown up assuming that communication required smartphones and internet connections learned that they could send messages across vast distances using methods that required nothing more than clear skies and careful timing. Adults who had felt helpless when their computers crashed discovered that they possessed knowledge and skills that were still valuable in an analog world. The educational implications were enormous. Schools around the world began incorporating analog communication methods into their curricula, not as historical curiosities, but as practical skills that might be needed in future emergencies. Students learned semaphore flags alongside computer programming, studied astronomy as a navigation and timing tool, and practiced interpretive dance as a form of non-verbal communication. The psychological benefits were equally important. In an age when many people felt overwhelmed by the pace of technological change, the Great Silence had demonstrated that humans could not only survive without their electronic devices, but could actually thrive, creating rich, complex, meaningful connections using methods that had been available for thousands of years. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the Vorthakian exploration vessel, Inevitable Bureaucracy, was heading home with a completely revised understanding of how the universe worked. Captain Flemhammer spent his time writing reports that he knew no one would believe. How do you explain to a civilization built on logical categorization and systematic analysis that you encountered a species that defied every known principle of xenobiology? How do you describe to colleagues who had spent their careers studying predictable, logical alien civilizations that humans were fundamentally, magnificently, completely unpredictable? The captain's reports were filled with phrases like adaptive creativity beyond theoretical parameters, coordination methods that transcend known communication principles, and recommend immediate revision of all existing civilization classification systems. His superiors would read these reports and assume that the stress of deep space exploration had finally gotten to him. Lieutenant Sneeze Nozzle occupied his time by developing new theoretical frameworks for understanding what they had observed. Traditional Vorthakian xenobiology assumed that all intelligent species developed along predictable technological paths, with communication systems that could be analyzed, categorized, and ultimately disrupted using established methods. Humans had demonstrated that intelligence could manifest in ways that were completely outside established parameters. They had shown that a species could be simultaneously primitive and advanced, chaotic and coordinated, dependent on technology, and completely independent of it. They had proven that the most sophisticated communication system in the universe might not involve any technology at all, but simply the willingness of individuals to work together toward common goals. Ensign Blurpington spent his journey home designing new classification systems that could accommodate species like humanity. His work would eventually lead to a complete revision of Vorthakian xenobiological theory, though it would take decades for the scientific establishment to accept his conclusions. The Vorthakian reports would eventually reach their homeworld, where they would be filed, analyzed, and debated by committees of scientists who had never encountered anything like humanity. The debates would continue for generations, spawning new fields of study and fundamental revisions to their understanding of how intelligence manifests in the universe. But the most important change was in the Vorthakian approach to first contact with unknown species. The human experience had taught them that their systematic, analytical approach to alien civilizations was fundamentally flawed. They had learned that intelligence could not be reduced to simple categories, that technological development did not follow predictable patterns, and that the most dangerous assumption was that any species could be easily understood or controlled. Future Vorthakian first contact protocols would emphasize communication over conquest, curiosity over control, and patience over presumption. They had learned that the universe was far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more dangerous than their theories had suggested. And every year, on the anniversary of what became known as the Great Silence, humans across the globe would simultaneously turn off their phones, step outside, and spend 1 hour communicating the way they had learned to during those 3 remarkable days, when the universe discovered that humanity's greatest achievement wasn't any machine they had built or any network they had created. Their greatest achievement was their absolute, unwavering, magnificent refusal to let silence be the end of the conversation. Communities would organize analog communication festivals where people would demonstrate the skills they had learned or maintained since the Great Silence. Children would compete in interpretive dance competitions, their movements conveying complex stories and ideas without a single spoken word. Amateur radio enthusiasts would set up mirror networks that could relay light signals across continents. Astronomers would coordinate global activities using stellar positioning, proving year after year that the most reliable communication system in the universe was the one that had been operating perfectly for billions of years before humans ever picked up their first stone tool. The festivals became celebrations not just of human ingenuity, but of human community. They were reminders that beneath all the electronic noise and digital distraction, people still possessed the fundamental ability to understand each other, to work together, and to solve problems using nothing more than creativity, determination, and the willingness to try something that had never been tried before. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Great Silence was the realization that communication had never really been about the technology at all. The smartphones and computers and satellites and fiber optic cables were just tools, and like all tools, they were only as useful as the intelligence and creativity of the people using them. The real communication system, the one that had allowed humanity to coordinate global activities using nothing more than flags and dancing and steam signals, was built from curiosity and empathy and the fundamental human desire to be understood and to understand others. It was a system that couldn't be jammed or disrupted or controlled by any outside force, because it existed not in machines or networks, but in the space between one person's desire to say something and another person's willingness to listen. The Great Silence had taught humanity that they were never really alone, never really disconnected, never really helpless, as long as they remembered that the most sophisticated communication system in the universe was the one they had been born with, the ability to reach out to another consciousness and say, in whatever way possible, I am here, you are there, and somehow we are going to figure this out together. Years later, when space exploration finally brought humanity into contact with other alien civilizations, their approach would be fundamentally different from what it might have been before the Great Silence. Instead of leading with technology, with displays of electronic sophistication or mechanical prowess, they would lead with the simple demonstration that they were a species that could communicate, could adapt, could solve problems, and could find ways to work together even when all their tools had failed. They would approach other species not as technological competitors or potential conquests, but as fellow travelers in the cosmic community of intelligence, each with their own unique ways of reaching across the void to say, "We are here, we see you. Let us learn together what it means to share this magnificent, impossible, endlessly surprising universe." And in the depths of space, traveling toward distant worlds where other civilizations waited to make their own first contact with the strange, wonderful, completely unpredictable species called humanity, the message would precede them, transmitted through quantum fluctuations and gravitational waves and the cosmic background radiation itself. Approach with curiosity, not conquest. These beings communicate through dancing, and they turn planetary geology into poetry, and when you try to silence them, they discover that silence itself is just another language they never knew they spoke.